The test will be in two parts, two different assignments. One will be for parts 1 and 2, which is a matching and fill in the blank. Those will be done online. The second assignment will be for parts 3 and 4, which will be the short answer and essay questions. Again, you'll pick 3 of 5 short answer and 1 of 2 essay questions. Is 2 enough? I mean, is a choice of 2 enough? Do you want a choice of 3? Okay, then we'll just stick with, why don't I do 3, because then I have 1 from each chapter, because some of you may be more interested in one chapter rather than the other. So I'll have 1 question on each chapter. How's that for a clue? Okay, and that'll be your longer essay. Okay, critical review. 1 is due on Tuesday, and the specifics are all spelled out on the coursework. Today we're finishing chapter 6 and have a little bit of review for the exam. We have a tour of the Newberry Emergency Operations Center coming up on October 12th. We'll meet at 9 o'clock. I'll have information for you on that on Tuesday. I'll post that online for you Tuesday, so make sure you check under announcements to know where we'll meet and whatnot. And we'll be getting an excuse from class that morning to be available for the afternoon classes to go from there. Okay. We also have a presentation by Paul Whitman, who's the Chief of Campus Security. He'll be here on the morning of October 19th. And then City Administrator and Fire Chief from City of Newberry will be here on October 21st. And so the thing for you to be doing is you should be well along with the outline and whatnot for your class project. Okay? So you understand what's involved in that. We talked about that on Tuesday. So the thing to do is when we have these presentations and we do the tour, is keep in mind, you know, what things they had to consider. What would they think to be important? Again, to tie in what we talked about last time, and we'll finish up this time with risk assessment. And then think of questions you might want to ask about their plan itself. What are some of the key elements they think fit in, and what were the challenges of putting those kind of things to help you put your project together. Okay? And we'll go from there. And like I said, I'll get, as soon as I get more information from the emergency manager at the county, I'll pass that information along about where we're going to meet and whatnot. They are mask oriented, so we'll have to wear masks and stuff like that. So we'll work. I will be driving down, and we can't do social distancing in my car, but I can take 3 students if anybody needs a ride that morning. If you think you do, email me, and that'll make a difference in where it is, because our operations center is about 3-4 blocks down the road at the county office buildings, I believe. So we'll pass that on as we get it for you. Okay. We're going to finish up chapter 6 on this notion of risk management. And one thing that's critical is this idea of the methodologies. And this is the traditional view. Figure 6.1 in your text has this. But it's talking about identifying the hazard. And so what are the hazard or hazards that may fit with your community, may be the need in your community? And that's going to be based on a variety of things: past experience, information coming from other sources. And the challenge here is identifying, using your imagination and identifying risks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Because you don't want to just do the tried and true, oh, we got hurricanes, tornadoes, fire, and then not worry about the rest. The others we'll talk about. So that's identifying. The analysis of the hazard means, what are the considerations? What are the likelihoods? What are the issues involved with that particular hazard that may need to be considerations that need to be made? And then the impact analysis is kind of some sense of what the potential impact is of that disaster, should it occur. Okay, so to divide it up in those 3 And again, your text talks at much greater length about that. And then THIRA. And again, as I said, if I show the abbreviation on the slide, on the PowerPoint, you're responsible for that acronym. There are lots of them out there, so I'm just relying on those. So if you go to figure 6.2 in your text, and that will be on pages 130 and 131, right? And this idea of THIRA we talked about, which is threat hazard identification and risk assessment. Okay. So review those. And so what it says is identify the threats and hazards of concern. Again, very similar but different methodologies. And so what you should be looking for is common elements in all of these methodologies. So identifying the threats and hazards of concern. Okay? Again, similar to what we saw in the other one. Give the threats and hazards context. And remember we talked about how oftentimes disasters are relative based on the community size, geography, potential resources, access to finances, things of that nature. So that's what this idea of providing some context is all about. Understand how it would relate in your community, what would be the challenge. And so that's back to that impact analysis. Okay. Establish capability targets. What that means is, what level of capability do you need to have? And by have, it's not only that your organization may have, but those capabilities that you need to make sure you have from some other sources. Whether that's from intergovernmental agreements where you work with another jurisdiction to share resources, fire, EMS, things of that nature, or whether you don't have the internal capability, and then who would you rely on? Because again, one of the themes throughout the semester in doing hazard management is that with the increase in professionalism, the manager is responsible for making sure you have the capabilities, but not necessarily providing the capabilities and managing them. So this idea of establishing capability targets is, okay, what do we have available in-house? What resources do we have immediately available? What do we have in terms of partners with whom we can coordinate and collaborate on this thing? And whether it's other jurisdictions of similarity, so if you're a city, other cities that may be nearby, within South Carolina specifically, the cities are within counties, what kind of county resources are available, what state resources are available, and what might you need to bring to bear on that, and then ultimately federal. So we understand that pecking order we've talked about several times so far. So that's identifying ahead of time what you need and what level of that capability you think you'll need in order to be able to work through actual recovery from the disaster. And then apply the results, okay, which means put those in play and then run your exercises, run your practices to see, does it flow, does it seem to work. And there you get into such ideas as the importance of best practices, the importance of talking with other jurisdictions of your similar size, and how they have got their put together, what are their resources they're considering. And just kind of, again, this idea of collaboration, this notion of no one organization has all the resources necessary to respond to disasters. So they have to build those relationships. And so then you go and put those inter-service agreements. And the things you have to be considerate of is, okay, so I'm working with my county, but if the disaster is limited to my city, then there's not a big strain on the county resources. They'll be able to jump in and help you. Well, what if it's a county-wide disaster, right? They will then have their resources spread out. And so how are you going to deal with that if it comes along? So always having these contingency plans of what if. And if you're lucky, you'll never need to go to plan B. But most of us at least end up on plan F or G by the time everything's done, or sometimes after that. So the more time you can spend beforehand thinking about identifying, discussing, collaborating, partnering, all those kind of things, the better able you will be to respond when an emergency or hazard does happen, and have a more positive result. This third one is Carver. And that was designed from the military, and it was designed specifically for special operations forces when they did target analysis and event analysis when they had some operation coming up. And so they had some topics in there that were critically important. And again, what if I were, you may have, you'll have an opportunity to demonstrate you understand the concept of having a plan in place. But the key elements, you'll see there's a lot of overlap on these things. Criticality, how critical is the mission? How critical is the hazard? What accessibility do we have to the resources that are needed? Now keep in mind, I'm using somewhat different terminology than the book has because I want to link it back to the civilian community, not specifically the military community. But how critical, so that's back to hazard assessment. This idea of accessibility and what resources do we have available for us. Recuperability, how long and what will be required for your organization to recuperate. And the recuperate isn't the restoration or restoring, but how will it be able to get critical services back in place? How will it be able to respond to those emergencies? Vulnerability. How vulnerable is your organization, right, to this type of hazard? The effect, again, what are going to be the effects of the disasters here that happened? And recognizability goes in from our purposes, not so much from the text point of view, because again, there's this focus on military. But ours is this recognizability of the potential for that disaster or hazard in the first place. Again, it's always challenging to get people fired up about things they don't want to talk about. And so when I was reading through this, the thing that came to mind under this idea of recognizability, if you remember back reading or through your text or other disasters that have happened, they're always concerned about the environmental impact, right? So before Katrina came through New Orleans, a big discussion was New Orleans is like it's below sea level, and you got all those levees around it. So it basically makes a big pool. So what happens to all the chemicals? All the solid waste, all the human waste? It's going to be stuck in that area. What's it going to be when it saturates into the ground? But how many people thought about that? How much of that did you hear about after Katrina went through? You heard about the human side, right? You heard about the problems with the centers for people to get to. You heard about problems with transportation of people leaving. But there wasn't a whole lot of talk about this toxic soup, right? Well, it wasn't front page news. You see the same thing in areas where there's large agriculture. Like we mentioned this several times before in eastern North Carolina, a lot of hog farms. Hogs create a lot of waste, and most of that waste is pumped into lagoons, so they can evaporate. When a flood comes and the dam is breached or the water in some way, where does all that waste go? Either into the ground around the area or into streams and waterways. How much does the average citizen think about those things? If you have a flooded area, what kind of chemicals do you have? What kind of paint do you have? Do you have propane tanks? What happens to all that stuff if there's a flood or a tornado comes through, all that hazardous waste? And that's the challenge from our perspective, again, not from the text perspective, but from our perspective on how this relates to what we do in the civilian world, is that how recognizable is the disaster? How do you get people to be concerned about that? I mean, how many of us read the labels on the bottles to talk about proper disposal? You're not supposed to throw batteries in the common trash. And yet, most folks, me too, right? It's just easier to chunk them in the garbage and take it down. That's why the landfills get to be so expensive, because you got to have liners and all those to protect from those things. So again, these are different than what the book says, but they tie into those other two models we saw, right? The idea of you identify what the disaster is and how critical is it going to be. What's our accessibility to resources? What is it going to take us to do rescue and recovery? How vulnerable are we to that type of disaster? What's going to be the impact or effect of that disaster? And then how do we get people fired up about it? Again, if you ask questions about these things, you're going to use that discussion to identify these terms, not what's in the book. Make sense? And again, one of the nice things about it, use a scale of 1 to 10. And you'll see in some of the other resources that we have available in this chapter, a lot of them have a ranking or scaling system. So one of the advantages here is they rate the potential positive and or negative consequences of those things to have some sense of priority. And then those priorities will then translate into what? Strategic planning and or tactical planning based on response needs. Okay. So what you should see on these things is those commonalities, all about identifying hazards, and hazards here are, any kind of hazard disaster that comes around. What's the likelihood of it happening? What's going to be the impact on your area? What resources do we have available to respond to it? Both internal and external. So you see those common themes. And that's the important takeaway from this discussion. Questions? Okay. And your text goes at great length talking about types of hazards. And here we're kind of using hazard / disaster interchangeably because a disaster is a hazard that's potentially to be there. They talk about natural disasters. So what are some examples of a natural hazard, a natural disaster that can take place? Pardon me? Wildfires. Pardon me? Drought. That can definitely have impacts across the way. What season of the year are we in now? Starts with an H. Followed by a U. Hurricanes. Absolutely. So we're in hurricane season now. That's a natural. Flood's a natural disaster. Right? So anything that's related to that, flood, big windstorms, landslides, earthquakes, all of those are natural disasters. And so you have to be. What was last week? We had 3 earthquakes in one day in South Carolina. Most of them centered around the low country, Somerville, in that area. And we all know that Charleston in the late 1800s was ravaged by a major earthquake. So we have faults that go through this area, but what's the probability of us having major earthquakes? Well, not high as in California, but do we consider that? One of the reasons they reinforced the Lake Murray Dam, have any of you been across the Lake Murray Dam lately? Well, they built a dam behind the dam. And the reason was in the initial assessment when the dam was originally built, they projected 1 level of earthquake. And so they built the earthen dam to withstand that level of earthquake. Years later, they did another assessment of the likelihood and the potential of a greater and realized that we need to have a backup because if we have an earthquake, it could be significantly larger than we thought. So that's why they put that dam behind it. So now when you go across it, going in one direction, you're up on top of the dam, and going the other direction, you're down in a valley between the 2 dams. Again, constant assessment and looking at what we can do. Technological hazard. What's a technological hazard that you can face? Power outages, yeah. Get by and do that. Okay. Most of you don't remember, but what was the Y2K problem? You ever hear that term? As we were coming into the year 2000, they realized that most of the computer programs only went through 1999. And so when it shifted over to the year 2000, there were all these concerns about all these computers breaking because the coding didn't allow dates past that time. Pardon me? Oh, yeah. Oh, it was amazing kind of stuff going on with it, yeah. So what they had to do was advance. So we had to go back and update computers and do all that changing. So that's an example of a technological disaster or hazard that's out there. they saw that, and hospitals didn't close down, but all the newspaper, there were dire warnings of all these things going on. So that's a technological hazard. Power outages. And so you saw that in Texas with the big ice storm, right? When the majority of the state was without electricity. And there were two reasons for that. One is that they had made the political decision not to be on interstate grids so they can avoid government regulation from the federal level. So once their internal system got overworked, they had no way to bring in outside electricity to help them. And second was when they had a cold snap, what was about 10 years prior to that, they were given all this advice, you need to fortify your electrical grid for cold weather, and they didn't do it. So because of their rate structure, you had heard examples of people getting, $1,000 electric bills for, a couple of days. Technological disaster, or hazard. Hazards that have happened, sun flares, solar flares. Why would solar flares be a technological hazard? They disrupt all the satellite communication that hooks most of the computers together. And so your ability to use your card at the bank, your ability to pay for your gas at the pump, all those things are there. So what protections do we have in place? So these technology, we're relying more and more and more on technology. And as I said, I gave my other two classes an assignment last week to answer 4 questions without using the internet. And first of all, they hated it. Told me never do that to them again. But the second was this realization how reliant we have become on technology. When you go to the gas station, how often do we want to walk inside and pay cash rather than pay at the pump? When I was at the airport in Sydney, Australia 2 years ago, their McDonald's in the airport was automated. You walked up to a kiosk, pushed what you wanted, gave you a total, you slid your card in, made the payment, and then you walked up to the counter and they gave you your bag of food. You didn't talk to a person other than say thank you or whatever that day. And so many other countries are much farther ahead of the United States in this idea. How many of you have gone to stores and they have automatic checkout? You do your own scanning and your own payment. You don't even talk to a person, right? So those are the things that are coming up, and it's become more reliant on technology. I saw in the news last night, Amazon has come out with kind of a robotic watchdog for your house. Go around after you leave and check, kind of like the Roomba or whatever, the Zumbas, whatever those electric or automatic vacuum cleaners. This goes around and can check your appliances to make sure they're turned off. You can check to make sure doors are locked. And that's coming, more technology, and it's become more and more dependent, especially in your generation, on technology. I mean, look at the stuff they're doing with radio frequency identification. And you already have now computers built into the doors on refrigerators so that you can create your shopping list. But long-term, the potential is to have all products have an RF code, and so when you put it in and take it out of the refrigerator, it tracks the expiration date. Is it close to the expiration date, it automatically reorders. Okay, that reliance on technology is wonderful stuff. I got an email yesterday from my internet service provider that said we're doing some advances in what we're doing things, so we've upped your bandwidth from 500 to 700 megabytes at no new charge. Just they've gotten more efficient. So I've got 700 meg service at my house for my computers and stuff. And that's a long way from the days when, did you guys ever hear of modems? And if you were lucky, you had a 26K modem. And if you're really fancy, you had a 52, right? Oh man, give me a break. It's amazing how we've become so reliant on these things. And then there are human caused. What are some human caused hazards? And you mentioned this under natural hazards, right, which were fires. But don't we have a lot of fires are finding now that are started by arsonists? The response needs to be the same, whatever the cause might be. But those are human caused. what are some other human-caused types of hazards we can face? Toxic spills. Right? Your book has a great example of the great molasses spill, where a tanker truck full of molasses spilled. And how do you get molasses out of everything? And the impact that had. Those are human-caused toxic spills. That's why they have, their EPA response teams that go out in the event of major accidents on either trains or on the highways because of toxic spills. We had what in South Carolina 10, 12 years ago, a train in the Aiken area, and it released sulfuric acid, I believe, and several people died immediately as a result of that accident. Those are human-caused because there was a relationship in there. So when you look together and you put together your proposals, you need to think about these. They may not all be necessary for your organization for the size that you're doing, but this idea of technology gets to be important. And then how do you deal with human-caused? So when we do, we have to have that much, much broader view of what we're calling hazards do we plan for. Now, do we plan for a molasses spill? Probably not. But do we look at how we're going to respond to spills of material based on traffic accidents or train accidents? What are we going to have in place? How do we deal with that? Yeah, that's... Got a great picture in here of, the Great Molasses Disaster leveled several blocks of Boston in 1919. There's a picture on page 138 of the aftermath of a molasses spill. So, that's the challenge in here, is kind of anticipate what could happen. So again, this Y2K was a known hazard, but getting people all the media attention that came about it made that be able to happen. So it was a known hazard, and in that case, they had no choice but to prepare for it because the consequences would have been dire. You also said, talks about the impact of repetitive events. What might that mean?
Kind of like hurricanes?
Yeah, look at the Gulf Coast. They've been nailed several times in the last couple of years with major hurricanes. And they haven't recovered from one of them when they get nailed by another one, right? So there's repetitive events. What's another example of a repetitive event that can have long-term impacts? And again, we talked about it with natural disasters and in human-caused disasters. Fires, right? So what are the issues with fires? What's some of the impact of fires all the time that go beyond just a notion of fire? There are two that should immediately come to mind.
Water consumption.
Well, water consumption, but take it a bit further. What happens if it's a big rain that comes into an area that's just been burned out? Mudslides. All that vegetation helps keep the soil. And so you have big rain after that. They always have issues of mudslides that come after that. But water, access to water, they've had that out in California. They've had so many fires that they're going into people's swimming pools and trying to find local areas to get water to be able to fight the fires. In South Carolina, they have a thing called a dry hydrant program. Have you heard of that? What they do is they get local folks that have ponds on their property, and they will put in a suction tube that'll run from their pond to the road. And so if a fire comes out and there's no hydrant close by, what they usually have to do is bring a tanker, and they set up a big tank and a big pool, and the tanker runs back to the nearest hydrant to fill up the water so they can fight the fire. Well, by having the dry hydrants, there's no water in them until you need them, and then you just attach your hoses to the pumper, and it pumps the water out of the pond to help fight the fire. Right? And that's a thing that South Carolina did probably 20 years ago. And so that's a challenge. Drought, the impact of droughts long term, on economy, on people. And, the great example of that is the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Human activity basically stripped the soil, took down all the things that held it together, And when the winds came, there was nothing there to stop it, nothing there to protect it. So they developed new strategies for rows and level and having kind of layers by doing no-till planting. Rather than go back and plow everything over, you just plant over the existing and use what's there to help. So I mean, a lot of those techniques come in, but these repetitive events, floods in the same area, fires in the same area, all those things are repetitive events. And then, so when you're doing your planning, you have to take that into consideration. All the flooding in Houston when they have big rainstorms, all of those issues. In New Orleans, they had that same impact of repetitive events because they have all of these levees, and they have little channels that lead to the pumping stations that suck the water out and pump it into Lake Pontchartrain. Seems like a pretty simple process, right? Well, the problem is that people were dumping their garbage and bicycles and shopping carts and whatnot into these channels. So when the water started getting pumped out, what happened? Yeah, all that stuff that was there got sucked into it, right? And so the pumps couldn't operate. All of those issues get to be involved in repetitive events. And these last two are this is one of those things that, people, don't want government regulation. But how might this impact of business license and commercial activities, how might they help you in preparing for hazards? How might knowing what kind of commercial activities are taking place in your area and the use of business licenses, how might that help in your hazard planning? Yes, sir.
Knowing what is happening near you helps you identify what resources you have to fight.
Yep. So you can use it from a positive side. What resources might they have? But most commercial activities generate waste of one kind or another, right? Some of them have hazardous chemicals. And so one of the reasons that business licenses can be an effective tool is if it's designed properly, you have to identify the kind of hazardous materials you have on site. So that when they get a fire in that area or have a spill in that area, the emergency responders going in know what they're going to be facing. And the challenge is, I know this comes as a shock, but people try to find ways to get around regulations. And so they store toxic waste, and they don't notify anybody. So when the first responders come in, did you see in the paper today, there's been a rise in forged COVID-19 vaccination cards in South Carolina? I mean, surprise, surprise. And that's the other challenge in putting together hazards. You can count on people to try to cut corners every way they can. You can have building codes in place, but if they're not strongly enforced, because it's expensive to have hurricane straps. It's expensive to have all those things. But when disasters come, it makes it a lot easier. So all these considerations, and your book goes into greater detail, obviously, on these things. But those need to think about those things. And oftentimes, we don't when we're putting these things together. A couple of significant, again, acronyms that would be good to know. The Superfund, what's a Superfund all about? You heard that term? The Superfund? That's federal dollars set aside for hazardous waste cleanup. And so you'll see that in some areas where there hasn't been tight regulation on solid waste landfills, where Superfunds will be used. If there is a big a pollution event in an area, if a company declared bankruptcy and bailed out, and there's nobody to hold accountable for it, then the government has to stop in to do the cleanup and remove contaminated soil, all of those things. So the Superfund is used to clean up hazardous sites where there basically is nobody around that you can hold accountable for it, either because they've just left the area or because they've declared bankruptcy and they have no resources left to do those things. OSHA or OSHA, depending on your pronunciation, Occupational Health and Safety Health Administration. I mean, they go in and they look at hazards, potential risks, and how you try to limit those in the first place. So OSHA becomes a good resource when you're doing your planning. And they can also help you identify what issues or challenges in your area might exacerbate any kind of disaster that you have. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and they get beat up all the time about things. And one of their jobs is to help do what? Protect the environment against. And finally, just flood insurance maps. And what you see in a lot of areas, in flood areas that are prone to be flooding, you'll be required as part of your purchase agreement and or getting a loan is to have flood insurance. And without flood insurance, you won't be able to get a loan. And these are updated periodically. That was a big issue 10, 15 years ago in South Carolina when a company, and if you've ridden on Highway 77 between I-26 and I-20, that's the back road to get into Williams-Brice, that area. Well, that's a big floodplain. And there was a company that wanted to get the flood maps changed so they could annex it and put houses in there. And that was a big issue with annexation because they wanted to get annexed to the city because they didn't have as stringent regulations. Of course, it got defeated and it didn't happen. But that was back to this notion of flood insurance and flood plains. And building in flood areas have a lot of consequences that need to be addressed. So, you know, that gets to be important as we go through and talk about these things. Key terms and their differences. You'll see these pop up periodically as you go through the whole reading. And the first one is this idea of continuity. What does continuity mean?
How consistent it is.
Pardon me?
How consistent something is.
Yeah. And from a continuity from a disaster is you oftentimes hear the continuity of government. How able is government to be able to continue to function in the face of disaster? Okay. So these idea of contingents or continuity issues or analysis, and those types of analysis are based on or focused on business processes, primarily business operations and government. How do they do certain activities? We'll be able to organizationally and managerially be able to continue to provide that services. And then the idea of threat issues and analysis are primarily focused on response capability. So continuity issues deal with continuity of government, primarily its ability to continue to function as viable. And probably one of the best examples is continuity of government issues when the president does the State of the Union address. What do we know about the cabinet? There's always one member of the cabinet who is a designated survivor. There's also a TV series about that.
Oh, yeah. He's like the one.
So he would be the one that would provide continuity of government because in the line order of succession. Because if you got a State of the Union address and a major event happens or gets blown up, then you lose the president, the vice president, members of cabinet, the president of the Senate, speaker of the House, all those folks. So, and how many of us think about that? But there's always that designated survivor, that one member of the cabinet who does not attend the State of the Union in the event that something happens. So you have that continuity of government. So again, differences. Continuity deals with government, ability for government to continue to function, to provide the services, the leadership, all those things that go on. And threat issues have to deal with response capability. So broad differences between those. Okay, figure 6.7. Got good figures this time. And that's on page 141. And the x-axis talks about the probability or the impact of a disaster. And the y-axis, if you look at it, talks about the probability. And so what you end up is then having a matrix. Those activities are the high probability but low impact, high probability, high impact, low probability, low impact, and low probability, high impact. So which ones do you think you would focus most of your attention on in that matrix? Yes, sir.
High probability, high impact.
Absolutely. You know, those activities that have a high probability of recurrence, and if they happen, it's going to have significant impact. So, which would you do next?
Solely low probability, high impact.
Yeah, you always look at the impact, because it may be a low probability, but you need to be prepared for the impacts, because that's what your response is going to be based on. What are going to be the impacts of it? So this is just a way, but it's a great matrix, but it all depends on what you consider a high probability and low probability, and what you consider to be high and low impact. So it's a great way, but it's all based on the assumptions you make, right, as to how well it works. But it gives you an opportunity, and there's a description below that that talks a good deal more about this notion of impacts and things of that nature. And the whole idea there is to have some kind of tools available to have some prioritization. And you saw that back with Carver when they ranked those on a scale of 1 to 10, so that you can take those issues that are the highest, pose the highest potential risk in terms of probability and impact, so that you can deal and have some prioritization. And then within that, you're going to have a prioritization of those that you have high impact, high probability. So you've always got to be thinking in terms of probability of event happening and basing it on that. So, you know, the challenge becomes, if you have something that's a low probability but a high impact, you better, you know, have plans in place for it. Even though the likelihood is slim, what are you going to do about it? And what you can often do in those cases is back to the great molasses spill. You know, the probability of a molasses spill is slim. Impact was significant. It destroyed several blocks. But you can then extend that to be any kind of recovery from spills of any kind. And what do we have in place to deal with that? So that's one of the advantages of these kinds of assessments and matrix to move forward. Figure 6-11, which is impact analysis. And these statistics are mentioned later. Why they don't have it in this graph, I don't know, for definition. But the y-axis is the level of impact, and the x-axis is the type of impact. And so what they talk about catastrophic is those events that result in greater than 50% damage, loss to an area. Where you'll see that happening is a lot. It's interesting. We have aliens in the room. What you see in that area is a lot of planning and zoning issues deal with what level of destruction is the ceiling or the floor, depending on how you want to talk about it, over which you cannot rebuild. And that'll be variety from area to area. But if you've got damage that's, you know, 25% or minimal damage, yeah, you rebuild, restore, and go on. But if it's over a certain level, you can't rebuild. You can't fix what you've got to tear it down and rebuild. And that has to do with health and safety, and has to do with quality of construction, things of that nature to move on. But that's an aside. But this idea of a catastrophic, critical is 25 to 50, limited is 10 to 24.9, and negligible. And that's, your text doesn't talk, your text goes this, but it's one of the things we learn when you're doing surveys. The way the text makes a distinction, critical is 25 to 50%, and limited is 10 to 25. So then where do you classify something that's 25%? Is it critical or limited? Critically, there you go, good answer, right? So I just changed it to 24.9. I mean, so you've got to have, anytime you're doing research, you're putting together, you've got to have non-overlapping limits, because that avoids any confusion, right? So that when you read, you'll see that the text says 10 to 25. I just changed it to 10 to 24.9. You don't have the overlap. And negligible is less than 10%. So that gets back into what the impacts are going to be, and you know that from past experience, from best practices, you know, and from any of the other scenario that you play out, what the potential impact is going to be. And then the Y impact talks about this idea of the type of impact. But they also have thrown us off a little bit with this hazard information. And what they're talking about is critical or catastrophic, 100% that's going to happen within the next year. And the challenge is that you have several areas recently that have had 100-year floods in a couple of years close together. So the question is, when is that 100, right? So these can happen all the time, and you're going to see that with climate change, that these impacts from natural disasters could become significant. You look at the number of named tropical storms we've had. They're run off the basic list and now going to a secondary list. Not all of them have hit land, thank goodness, but there's been a significant damage that goes on. Okay, so you look at the human impact, economic impact, and service impacts. And again, just another way to look at these things, considerations on a catastrophic, if it's 100% chance of it happening in 1 year, that's what high probability. And then speed of the onset minimal. So what's an example of a catastrophic hazard? Hurricanes. You got plenty of time to prepare. The onset is slow because you've got all this tracking. Some that aren't slow to get here are things like what? Tornadoes, floods, not always, So wildfires are an interesting example because they happen immediately when they happen, but then you get some sense of the spread, so you can then do your strategic responses and your tactical responses based on weather conditions and things like that. So all of these are helpful. No one is perfect. None of these tools, but they help your thinking when you go through on how do I rank, how do I prioritize potential disasters, potential hazards, so that we can have plans in place to deal with those that are most probable, but then still have contingency plans to deal with broad areas. Yeah. So critical 6 to 12 hours. Tornadoes are much less than that because oftentimes they know the storm is coming and they can give warning hours ahead of time. But the actual touchdown of a tornado is very limited advance warning on those things to move forward. And then beneath that, so the impact just shows the actually has some idea of the hazard, some information about probability and severity and how quickly it's going to impact us. Human impact, again, what's going to be the human toll, what goes on. What's going to be the economic impact in terms of losses, which would be some are insured, some are uninsured, which that impacts the ability to get money, other types of economic impacts. And most states, including South Carolina, have laws against price gouging and things of that nature that come up to get to be important. And then what's the impact going to be on government services? Right? That's going to be an issue that we have to deal with. And government service or fire, police, EMS. And then, as we had in New Orleans, the whole criminal justice system. They lost most of their records, and a lot of people got released from jail, and they had no tracking on them. What impact is that going to have across the board? You've seen that in South Carolina, and one of the TV shows that I record to watch as time permits is Chicago Fire. Not good, not bad, just there. And one of the issues they've been having in South Carolina, and you've seen if you looked at the paper recently, is the number of non-emergency calls that come into EMS. And they have to respond to all of them. Because if they don't respond, here's my attorney's card, we'll be in charge, we'll sue you. But that was one of the highlighted issues on Chicago Fire last night, is the number of non-emergency calls. And then how do you deal with those? How do you identify those? Right? And I know from people who work in EMS area that it is not uncommon for people needing a ride to town to call up EMS and get a ride to the hospital emergency room. And then as soon as they get checked in, they leave and head to where they're going to go, use it for taxi service. They have people that call, and examples that are on the news, they call for things that are obviously non-emergencies. but they think it's an emergency kind of stuff. And so that gets to be an impact on services. And you always hear that. What's one of the warnings that oftentimes goes out when a hurricane's coming and people choose not to evacuate? Right? What impact does that have on services? They can't do their job because the disaster is on top of them, and yet you want to try to help people. So it's and the other one I've heard from several places is make sure you write your Social Security number on your arm someplace so we can identify you when you find your body. That's more scare tactic, but the reality is the same. You get swept away. Look at the tsunami that happened in Sri Lanka and whatnot several years ago. All those people just swept out. Some they'll never find to do those things. But anyway, the impact it has during the emergency. And then the impact area analysis it is on page 144, and it takes these 13 issues to make sure we look at them. And again, this is the kind of question where I wouldn't ask you to identify all of them. I would say, like, we have identified 13 areas that we need to include an impact analysis, discuss any 2 of them. Okay. And to be able to go into some detail. And this has a good discussion of those as we go forward. We will not be talking about business, as in commercial businesses. Our business assessment is always going to be related to government and government functions. Because businesses, as we will hear from Ms. Williams later this semester, have their own approach to emergency management, emergency response. They do all those considerations. So the business implications of those who relate to government and government services. So while case study 6.1 is interesting, we're not going to talk about it. Okay. I love this quote on page 146. The public sector is not immune to loss of reputation. Following Hurricane Hugo in 1989, Senator Ernest Hollings, Democrat of South Carolina, in criticizing FEMA's slow response to the hurricane, to refer to the agency as, and I'm quoting here, the sorriest bunch of bureaucratic jackasses I have ever encountered in my life. So, and when they get those reputations, it impacts the confidence that the public has in them, and therefore their effectiveness, their ability to do their job as we move forward. Continuity of government issues. There are 3 terms that come in, or 5 that we're going to be using. And your text has information on each of these as you read through. National essential functions, primary mission essential functions, and then just other mission effective essential functions. So all of these are considerations. What's at the national level? How does it impact a primary mission, and what impact does it have on other missions of organizations within the government? The ability to respond. And you see these other 2 terms, COOP, which stands for Community of Operations, and COG, which stands for Continuity of Government. And the COOP sections tend to refer primarily to business practices, just like we saw with continuity earlier on. The COG has to do with government issues, so they're 2 separate functions. So from the operations perspective is the business application of what government does and how it works, but continuity of government is the ability of government to continue to function in a meaningful way. Because what are some of the things that oftentimes happen with an impending disaster and the immediate aftermath of a disaster? You see this in New Orleans. You saw this after Hurricane Hugo in Charleston. You had it after Hurricane Katrina. And you also had that recently after Hurricane Ida. It starts with an L, followed by an O. Looting. People are breaking the law. It's a funny story. I had a friend of mine whose house was basically flooded out during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And we're talking to her about it. She said, yeah, people broke into my house and they stole the refrigerator and the TV, which were all underwater. But because there was so much mud in the house, they didn't go through the drawers in the bedroom, which I had all of my jewelry and stuff were in those drawers. They didn't want to stick their hands in the mud and stuff like that. So they stole TVs and refrigerators that were in the water. But, right? So this looting goes on. You see that all the time. So what you can do with law enforcement? In some areas, they nationalize the National Guard to help provide protection against looters because the citizens aren't allowed to go back in the area because it's not safe. And I'm sure you all saw pictures after Ida going through Louisiana, all our alligators swimming in people's yards. I had a friend of mine whose family went through Hurricane Hugo, and they were talking about all the dead fish that were in their house. All of these issues get involved as we go forward, and we've got to consider and think about those things. Good terminology. On figure 6-16. Or did I get a typo on that? No. On 16, it's on page 159. Okay, those are mission essential functions. But that one is specifically designed for non-federal governments. So that would be for state and local governments, for special purpose districts, any non-federal level government. This is kind of the checklist that would apply. Now, why do I say that? Because my guess is that most of you are going to be using some level of government less than the federal government because it's a lot easier to do. You'll pick a city, a county, or a state and look at that area from your emergency plan. And easiest of those would be to pick a municipality or a city or a school district or something like that to put together your plan. And then this will be a nice resource for you as you think about issues and prioritizing what you're going to be able to do. Okay? And so it goes through this idea of critical functions, mission essential functions. What are they? Description, impacts if not conduced, and they're not able to continue. Recovery time. So it's all that thinking that goes into what do I need to prepare for, what are the functions, so it takes it down to that level, another nice checklist to go through. And again, most of you would be able to use probably a city or a county government or a school district of that nature to do those things. Which would be interesting because you'll see the difference in Newberry between the city and the county. The county has an emergency operations center. They have an identified person who's their, Tommy Long, who is their emergency manager, and we'll get a tour of their facilities. The city of Newberry does not have an emergency manager. It's kind of a shared responsibility between the fire chief and the administrator. So what they have available to them. So that's why we talk so much about understanding the context and the relativity of disasters. There is an example. So the city of Newberry has stuff in place, but they would have to oftentimes rely on the county for the higher level issues that take place. And so it's important to have that good relationship. And again, that's something to talk about. But that's a great example of how. And then Newberry, the Newberry College, the chief of security is kind of the person that does it. But yet, and this is a good question, is when they put together their emergency plan, what are the emergencies do they consider? How do you function to put that together? So, again, a nice resource as you build your projects that you're going to do. And there are several things there that talk about it. And these are, again, you ought to start seeing some common themes of this whole process. It's having an organized structure, having a system, a process in place, almost like a checklist to go through, right? And these mission essential functions, again, this is back to the operations. What are the outcomes by functions? What do they do? How do they contribute to the operation? Why might that be important to know what their contribution is? Starts with a P, followed by an R.
So they get prepared.
Pardon me?
So they get prepared.
I. Yeah. prioritization, that ranking, because you're going to deal with what those whose functions have higher levels of outcome, more critical outcomes for the organization. So you'll be worried about the office people, but you're going to be more concerned about EMS, law enforcement, those kind of folks. So knowing what the function is they provide will help you prioritize where I need to focus to go through. You pay attention to all of them, but it's back to you have to have some priorities. And oftentimes that priority will be a function of the disaster itself. But just be thinking about those things. And sometimes, one of the easiest things to do would be require each department head to come up with how they're going to respond within the context of the overall program. Does that make sense? Rather than you trying to go in and figure out, perhaps one would be to have them help you put it together. What leadership is needed? And, there's a great example from the national level when President Reagan was shot. One of his cabinet members said, "Don't worry, I'm in control." And he wasn't. He wasn't in the line. But he was there in Washington, and the message he was trying to send was, "Don't panic, we got things under control." I mean, as long as you didn't pay attention to the details, it actually wasn't, but that's beside the point, right? He was trying. So what leadership do we need? Leadership not only from a political perspective, you want to have your chief elected officials, if nothing else, being a spokesperson for what's going on, because they have that linkage. What level of leadership? What happens if a level of leadership is out of town at a conference and a disaster hits? Who's going to be in charge? Because they're not going to be able to get back in time. So what's going to be your chain of command? If the chief isn't here, who's going to be next in charge, and have that line that goes down? And then what staff is required? And the importance here, and what's the potential of happening at midnight tonight? Government shutdown. They're having another fight in Washington about funding and continued funding. So there's a big hold up there. So the potential is the government will run out of money at midnight tonight. Which this required staff, they have essential and non-essential workers. And the non-essential workers are sent home to sit around until they solve the issue, and they'll get back pay, but it doesn't help them in the meantime. Essential workers are required to work without pay. So the military, if the shutdown comes, won't get paid, and yet they can't go home, right? But they'll close down parks and recreation activities and things of that nature. So required state. How do you not know this stuff? Whoa, okay. Pardon me?
I'm in my permit hole.
Oh, come on, I'm in the hose, but I got 700 meg speed now, so I can watch it all. Right, but who's the required staff? Who are the essential people? Because you don't want everybody to show up if there's no need for them. But who do we have to have? Who are those key personnel that we need to have available to us to help respond and keep things moving along? Okay, and then another way, identify communications and IT requirements. And we saw that communication IT requirements and the whole debate. Remember we talked about after 9/11, this notion of interoperability. Remember that discussion that had to do with the radio equipment? And they spent all this money to make sure everybody was on the same channel, but didn't take into account that the fire and the police never liked anybody in the first place. Okay. Identify needed facilities. And one of the things that does, by identifying the facilities that are critical, then you can help prepare for it by this notion of mitigation. Find likely damage that will happen to that facility and what can we put in place beforehand, right? Put in sump pumps to get water out of the building. Put in hurricane-proof windows. So by knowing what's essential. Identify what resources and money. Because oftentimes what's going to happen is in the aftermath of a disaster, commercial activity goes down the tubes. And as that goes down, revenue goes down for the jurisdictions. So how are we going to get money? What funding is available? This notion of identifying partners and dependencies, what that means is who are we going to work with, the idea of collaboration, and who are we essentially very dependent on to show up. And so how do we strengthen that relationship and make sure we have that all covered? That flow make sense? Okay. And then when you're done with that, then describe kind of the overall process. How is it going to work? What are going to be our key people? What are going to be our key facilities that we need to do? What are we going to have? How are we going to communicate with each other? What kind of IT resources are we going to have available? So I don't know if Newberry has solved this, but at one point in the not too distant past, they had only one internet trunk line coming into Newberry. So that was occasionally cut or made inoperable, so they had no internet service. There was talk, and they may have already put it in, of putting in another trunk line. So you had a backup plan, IT needs. And what's one of the other big issues now that we have to think about from an IT perspective? What's one of the biggest challenges being faced by major institutions and government that are hazards? More fundamental than that. Starts with an H, followed by an A. Hacking, right? Ransomware. You know, people hacking into government systems and shutting them down, right? And demanding ransom to put it back online. The sophistication of these attacks are critical. So this whole notion of, as we become more technologically connected, we need to be concerned about how we protect, because those can be major issues. Yeah. To make sense. So anyway,